set? Well, everybody, I think we can start. And this is a great crowd this morning. This is an important subject, and it's good to see all of you here. I want to welcome you all. I think most of you know me. I'm Dick Morningstar, and founding director and chairman of the Global Energy Center here at the Atlantic Council. And I'm pleased to welcome you here this morning for the discussion of Anya Grigas's new report on natural gas diplomacy strategy for our new U.S. administration. And by the way, there are reports outside that you can, if you haven't already picked them up, you can pick them up as when you leave. So, you know, I have all these little talking points here that are very good, but I may be just stating the obvious. We know that the United States has emerged in recent years as a leader in the production of natural gas and LNG, and there is an opportunity for the new administration and Congress, the Republican majority Congress, to reassess our energy policies relating to natural gas. And I think the President has made clear during the campaign that gas exports is something that he wants to encourage, and it's not as easy, as we'll see during the discussion. It's not as easy as that just to make that statement. There are a lot of complex questions that relate to it. But as Anya mentions in her report, there really is an opportunity to expand our influence, and that natural gas exports can be good for jobs in the United States. It can be good for our foreign policy. So not only are we eager to learn today from you, Anya, on your thoughts on what U.S. priorities should be, we also look forward to discussing recent developments that are taking place and what that strategy ought to be. The panel, of course, will be involved in that discussion first after Anya gives her opening presentation, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. But we do have an impressive panel with us today. Anya is the author of the report. She's a senior fellow with us here at the Atlantic Council. I'm not going to go into extended biographies because you have them in front of you. We also have, and this is going to be very helpful, I think, Sudine Kelly, who's a partner at Aiken Gump and chairs the firm's energy practice. And Sudine is also a former commissioner with the FERC and is in a particularly good position to talk about whether or not procedures need to be streamlined and how they could be streamlined. And then we have Tim Boersma, who we know well here at the Atlantic Council from his days at Brookings, and you're now associated with Jason Bordoff's Center at Columbia. So we always look forward to hearing from Tim. So I want to thank you all for being here today, and we want to remind everybody this is an on-the-record discussion, and it will be streaming live. So, anything here that's said by anybody is public. And you can join in the conversation on Twitter at AC Global Energy, and don't forget to hashtag AC Energy. So Anya's going to speak for no more than 10 minutes, and I've moderated enough of these conversations that I will pull out the hook after 10 minutes if it goes longer, and then I'll ask some questions and then go to the audience. So, Anya.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming. This report draws on a 2-year research project, and it actually draws on the findings of my newest book, The New Geopolitics of Natural Gas, which is forthcoming from Harvard University Press this April. So this report and this book draws, I think, something we all know here today, that these are indeed very exciting times and changing times for those of us that watch energy. the global energy markets and America's domestic energy standing really couldn't be more different today than it was 8 years ago when President Obama took office. And there are three key factors here we see today. Well, one is that the U.S. is now emerging as an energy superpower. It is the largest natural gas producer in the world. It is the largest oil producer in the world. And it's poised to be today as a significant LNG exporter. We also see the natural gas markets experiencing what I believe is really a historic shift, a major transition from gas being a localized and regional resource to gas increasingly becoming a global or more global commodity. And we certainly have a new presidential administration, an administration that has expressed that they're going to be very bullish on energy. We have already an America First energy plan that will prioritize energy production, and we will see more what that means, I think, this year. And we also have, very fittingly, seemingly for an energy superpower, Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of energy giant Exxon, now being poised to be our next Secretary of State. So indeed, it would appear that the time would be right for America to harness its energy superpower status and pursue energy diplomacy. At the same time, we also have an administration that has stated that they will put America first, always. And we will see what that will mean, whether indeed energy policy will be focused only on domestic benefits, jobs, production, and so on, or whether there will be also a view towards how energy can be used for American foreign policy, how it can be used to support its allies, and so on. So why the focus on natural gas markets? And this is really the focus of my report and the focus of my new book. As I mentioned, gas is on the verge of becoming a global commodity. And it's really different from when it was a local, a regional resource that was difficult to transport, that had to rely on land-based pipelines, and where the gas trade relationships were always or often highly politicized. So right now we have a boom in global gas production. I mean, that was really spearheaded by the U.S. shale revolution. We have a growth of LNG trade, and we have a buildup of gas transport infrastructure worldwide, particularly import and export, but also other types of gas transport infrastructure. And the United States became an LNG exporter in 2016, despite the low gas prices and despite some maybe market caution. American LNG exports went across the globe. I mean, the list of countries is impressive. It really went worldwide: Brazil, India, United Arab Emirates, Argentina, Portugal, Kuwait, Chile, Spain, China, Jordan, Dominican Republic, and Mexico. So despite, again, some skepticism, it appeared that it was economic for American LNG exports to go across the globe. And we also are experiencing a change in how gas is traded, in those common practices of gas trade. And the United States is really leading that change. So we are witnessing a move away from long-term gas contracts towards more spot trade and shorter trades. We're seeing a move away from oil-linked contracts to more hub-based pricing for gas. And we see destination clauses increasingly disappearing. So what does that mean for the United States? What does it mean for its foreign policy opportunities? I believe that this really represents an unprecedented opportunity for the United States to take a leadership role in the global gas markets, to cement its position, and to pursue natural gas diplomacy. So it would mean supporting its allies in Europe. The United States has long had an interest in helping Europe diversify away from Russian gas. Certainly, as we'll go into the discussion, it's not so simple because commercial matters drive those exports. But there's also an opportunity to contain some of our adversaries, such as Russia, which has Before the U.S. emerged as the leading gas producer, it was Russia, the leading gas producer and exporter. And this gives us an opportunity to potentially reshape relations with some of our rival powers, particularly the energy-hungry powers such as China in Asia and others. This gives the United States a carrot of energy exports. And what could be some of the main results of this changing geopolitics of natural gas? I believe that this liquidity and optionality in the markets will depoliticize gas flows. And it is already, I think, becoming evident that as importers have more options, as importing countries, they're in a better bargaining position with exporting countries. So it's becoming a type of buyer's market. And this benefits many of our existing allies in Europe. In terms of some recommendations I go a little bit in the report in this, but some of the recommendations are, I believe at this point, the United States, while it thinks about America first and it thinks about America first energy policy, it should also take this opportunity to solidify its position in the global energy markets. One, it's about really maintaining a steady course. In many ways, what was already done over the past 8 years with production and exports. But it's also about boosting infrastructure. And from what we hear from the new administration, he's certainly in favor of infrastructure. In terms of gas pipelines, there's certainly some improvements that can be done, particularly connecting existing gas production regions to either consumer markets in the United States or with export terminals. There's opportunity to help eliminate environmentally damaging practices like flaring, which is burning off of gas, if there is the existing infrastructure to collect that gas and, again, help reach it to market. Trade agreements, I think, are going to be certainly a consideration in this new administration. Certainly doesn't appear to be appetite for free trade agreements, as we've seen from the canceled TPP, and seemingly TTIP is going to have a similar fate. But there's room for considering other trade agreements that would boost American LNG exports. And I think there's also, importantly, room for cooperation with our allies, particularly NATO, about energy security. NATO over the years has really thought about energy security and energy, but it has not yet developed a comprehensive maybe strategy and approach to that. And the United States, now as an energy superpower, as a leading gas producer, as a rising gas exporter, has an opportunity to take a leading position on this issue. So I'll stop here. I think we'll have an interesting discussion on some of the nuts and bolts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Agnia. And I think you gave an exceedingly clear presentation of the issues, which I think gives us the basis for further conversation. We're really, I think, very fortunate to have Sudine with us. It's not often that we have a real FERC person here, even if formally so. And let me start by, asking you this. Whenever we would have the discussion on simplifying LNG export procedures during the past administration, even directly with the Secretary, Moniz, he would say, come on, it's not necessary. Licenses are being granted. There's plenty of opportunity now to export. Trying to play with it isn't going to really increase things, certainly not in the short to midterm. What's the big fuss? So I'll ask you that question, having been at FERC.
Well, thank you, Dick. I do think that there is some room for improvement and for efficiencies. But before I answer your question, I just wanted to say that I am very pleased to be here and how fortunate I am and the gas industry, the regulatory side of the gas industry, is to have Anya choose to spend her experience and her prodigious intellectual capacity and put it into this field. And I rely not only on the research that she produces, but also the analysis that she does. She's exceedingly insightful, and I also appreciate that you take it that next step and come up with policy recommendations. So thank you for
Thank you, Sudhir. Thank you.
having me here today. So can we make the process more efficient? Yes, we can. There's really two steps to making this export happen in the regulatory arena. We need approvals for export facilities, LNG export facilities, and we need export authorizations. The former comes from FERC. That's a long process. It's regulated by the Natural Gas Act, and there are a lot of requirements that applicants have to go through and meet to come up with an authorization. It takes years. Can it be done more quickly? Yes, a bit more quickly. I think if we had more resources devoted to it at the agency, we could move it along faster. But there's a constraint, and that is that there is significant opposition now and will continue to be to the issuance of these authorizations. And everyone is contested, and everyone will be litigated, and everyone will be appealed to the Circuit Courts of Appeal. In order to prevail in the courts, you have to have an exceedingly complete record. So we can speed the process up a bit, but the constraint is that we can't move so fast that we don't create the record that establishes the need for it and the environmental acceptability for it. At the DOE side, on the export license side, I think that Governor Perry, when he's confirmed as Secretary of Energy, could take some steps to increase the certainty associated with that process. There used to be conditional export authorizations that were issued early with conditions that had to be met when the environmental assessment was done. The Obama administration eliminated that process. I wouldn't be surprised if we see Secretary Perry reinstitute it. The process is much more involved when the export is going to a non-free trade agreement country. In that case, a DOE looks to see whether it is, quote unquote, in the public interest. And that's, it'll be interesting to, and that phrase can be interpreted differently. It's in the statute as public interest. The Obama administration was very concerned about the amount of LNG that would ultimately be authorized for export and the impact that that would have on domestic prices as demand for that increased. Consequently, there was a condition put, as best as I can recall, in every export authorization, a condition that the authorization could be reopened. And that injects uncertainty into the marketplace to an extent. So I think it will be, at a minimum, fascinating to watch how policy unfolds at DOE, and the arguments that Anya makes, I'm sure are going to be made in the halls of DOE and in the Secretary's office.
Let me follow up with one more question, then I'll ask Tim a few questions. What's the effect? Do you think there will be an effect by the new administration, President Trump, pulling out a TPP by, let's assume for the purposes of this discussion that TTIP is dead, which I think it is for the time being anyway, and there would be concomitant free trade that would allow for free trade in LNG. The failure to do that, how serious a problem is that, do you think?
What Dick is referring to is that the Natural Gas Act, when it comes to export authorization, has two different categories of approvals. One approval is virtually guaranteed if the export is going to a free trade agreement country. If it's not, the process is more involved. So, at least on the face of it, having fewer free trade agreement countries will have an adverse, somewhat, impact. On the other hand, the way that the trade actually works is that because the LNG market is so logistical, even if you are selling into a known market, and it's a free trade agreement country and you have an export authorization, you really don't want to stop there. Because of the nature of the marketplace and to an extent the volatility of it and price, you may have your shipment in the ocean going to a destination and all of a sudden it's not going to work. And you need to send it somewhere else. It's expensive to just park it in the middle of the Pacific or the Atlantic. So in reality, if you are an exporter, you need both authorizations because you need a blanket authorization so that you can transport it to non-free trade agreement countries.
So that's an interesting point. So basically what you're saying is the key is streamlining the procedures in the first place, given that exporters are going to need that
no matter
depending on what happens to a shipment once it's gone.
Right. And how you interpret public interest, how this administration interprets public interest.
Right. Anya, you wanted to say
just
something.
to jump in quickly, basically canceling TPP will impact 3 markets immediately because among the TPP countries, not all were, let's say, LNG importers. Some were, in fact, exporters. But the markets where it really matters is Japan. That's a considerable potential market for American LNG exports, and then Malaysia and Singapore are other LNG importers.
Good. Tim, we've talked many times, either on panels or otherwise, about European energy security, the effect of Russia, our maybe differing opinions to some extent on Nord Stream 2. Certainly over the past few years, we've discussed that. I have, I guess, 2 questions to ask you. Is there any kind of inherent contradiction between what would assumedly be this administration's focus on more LNG exports, and if they do, in fact, have some kind of reset with Russia and reduce opposition to increased European dependence on Russian gas? And I guess the corollary question is, does it even matter what we think? Has it mattered what we thought over the past, past years?
Yeah.
And will it matter if we change our position towards Russia? And isn't it all, at the end of the day, or this is a question, a Europe-Russia issue, and that there may be issues within Europe, but the U.S. doesn't really have much of a role anyway?
Well, thanks first of all for having me. That very basic notion, what exactly the influence of the U.S. is when it comes to energy diplomacy, is something that we talked about previously. It's a question that I've been grappling with and puzzled about for some time, and I don't have a final answer. We may well find out. We've had an administration that was very active in what it called energy diplomacy. And if I were to characterize that and not do justice to all the great work the State Department did in this space, then it meant that the special envoy and his staff oftentimes went to Europe and urged allies not to build Nord Stream 2, and that was so. And we're gonna now find when you stop doing that, which may happen. We don't know that, but it may happen. Whether that then has an effect, and of course there may be tons of other factors that tie into this, but. I think that so there may be a contradiction. There are many inherent contradictions in what we've learned so far about this new administration. Obviously, there is, I think, an inherent contradiction in, on the one hand, wanting to unleash an energy revolution to the extent that hadn't happened already, but promoting domestic coal production and gas production at the same time seems at odds, right? And then, remarks and desires that we've seen towards building international alliances, helping out friends, and that seems somewhat contradictory too, or at least at least potentially. So, I think there are more questions than answers at this point. But I'd be very interested to see. So I don't expect, in the short term at least, curtailments of energy trade per se. There are a number of reasons to think that. The president has expressed his support for trade, although I would remind that as a candidate at some point he was asked, it was mentioned to him that LNG exports were bound to rise rapidly, and he said, "That's great news. I support that." And then the second question was, "What is LNG?" So I'd be at the same time, a little bit more cautious as to say, how definitive that answer was. There is obviously, with the new Secretary of State and new Secretary of Energy, more proven support for energy trade, if you will, and free trade. To what extent the State Department is going to keep up its work that it's done under the previous administration is I think, a question that is to be answered. We don't know. It could well be that Secretary Tillerson wants to expand on this in this field, or maybe he doesn't. He has other priorities. But going forward, I think a question to ask is and to contemplate is what happens if. So we can all be in favor of free trade. What happens if natural gas prices spike in say 6 or 12 months' time? And what does the president do then when he looks at where these exports actually go and finds out that the majority of them flow to Mexico? Does he then look for opportunities to curtail that trade? We don't know that. Again, this is all uncharted territory. But I think those are questions to grapple with. So on the one hand, we have an architecture, and as Agnia describes in her paper, we have a diplomacy architecture that has been built for an extensive period of time, but it may be up for debate. We'll have to wait and see.
You wanted to?
I do. Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
From my perspective, I do see a type of contradiction between potential interests of the United States to establish closer relations with Russia and at the same time the energy realities, because I find that the interests are at odds. And from those of you who know a little bit my work that I do on Russia and Russian foreign policy, it's another area where I think there are many areas where American and Russian interests are in fact at odds. But today, Russia and the United States are in fact competitors in the energy markets. They're both natural gas producers. They're both exporters. And certainly for Russia, energy exports have always been crucial. It's the underlying resource for their economy. It's the main source of revenues for their budget. So Russia has worked, hard to try to maintain and hold on to their markets. So I think there will be this, conflict of interest as we go forward, not in some other areas that we know, more traditional security, let's say, and foreign policy areas, but also this conflict of interest in the energy markets.
I wanted to ask Anya a question about oil prices. How should we think about the oil prices that our LNG exports compete with when you get into the diplomacy arena? If the LNG is competitively advantageous vis-a-vis oil prices, then we're all swimming in the same current. But if it's not competitively advantageous, will the desire to use it as a strategic resource override the competitive disadvantage? Would it make it more difficult for us to be supportive of it as a matter of diplomacy, or not?
I think we had a brief discussion about this, and I think this is a very interesting point, because right now many people do discuss, well, are energy prices going to rise, or oil prices are going to rise, and essentially, well, then gas prices would follow. And this can have a twofold effect. On the one hand, if natural gas prices rise, then American LNG exports become more competitive. They become more competitive in Europe, in Asia, and beyond. So this would be a positive for American LNG exports. But at the same time, there's also, and Tim alluded to this, there's also fears that if energy prices rise, then there will be domestic political considerations for the United States, particularly for the Trump administration that really holds an America first type of policy. So if energy prices are high, will the United States be as supportive of LNG exports and would prefer to keep these resources at home to support American industry, let's say, to give America an energy advantage? But then the question is, and then I can turn it back to Sudhin, what can the U.S. government do to, in a sense, can they really block LNG exports? This is in many ways a matter of private industry, private enterprise. So Sudhin.
Thanks, Heidi. Well, they can block it because the Secretary of Energy has the power to put conditions in the export license and has done that with a big reopener for to, in fact, stop the export under particular contracts and authorizations if he deems it to cease to be in the public interest to do so. So, indeed, they can do that. At least so far, they have reserved that power. The government has reserved that power to itself by putting that condition in the authorization. So we'll watch with interest to see if that policy changes. The other interesting point that you raised was the impact of rising gas prices on domestic industries. And actually, one of the big proponents in the Obama administration for putting these conditions in the license was the American domestic petrochemical industry, which needs gas as a feedstock and is advantaged with low gas prices and obviously disadvantaged as high gas prices go up. So it's not just the residential consumer in Boston who's concerned about gas prices. It's a major U.S. industry, that is.
Thank you. I'm going to go back with one more follow-up question to Tim. Then I have one other question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. Is listening to some of the answers with respect to Russia, and is there a contradiction, with exporting LNG and, Russian energy exports to Europe and so forth? Is that an oversimplification? I mean, aren't there? It seems to me there are a whole lot of other factors that are involved in the equation, and the key is that Europe have a competitive market. And even if there is a lot of Russian gas going into Europe, as long as there's the opportunity for LNG, other potential routes, all of the other things that Europe is trying to do to integrate its market, and I could go on and on, that you really can't talk about about it being a contradiction.
Well, I don't know, but I think your point's well taken. That's been I think the chief message for European policymakers writ large is that enhanced cooperation and better market integration is their number one tool to enhance their overall energy security. They've been making great progress, as you know, and you've done a lot of work here. And there's been a lot of work done elsewhere on this topic. So I think, I would look at this election and the outlook that is uncertain at the moment, and see that from a European point of view as a gentle reminder that your chief goal ought to be to make yourself resilient and continue those efforts, right? And I think it's too early to say what exactly future policy will be from the U.S. and whether there will in fact be trade restrictions. I find it hard to get my head around that, but who knows? Does it really matter until it happens? No, because the chief message is still for Europeans to get to get their own house in order, and the new president's perception of alliances, including those with European allies, with NATO, I think it's not a gentle, it's a pretty strong reminder for Europeans to get moving, assess their own interests, and pursue those. So I think that's right. And so on the one hand, we've had a U.S. administration that has supported and advocated free trade and open markets for a very long time, and that is changing now. And to what extent? Again, it's too early to tell, but it is changing now. Does that then really matter? No, it's for Europe a good signal to continue its efforts and intensify them actually.
Well, there's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years, especially in this town, about really the impact of U.S. LNG exports on Europe. And I think a lot of the discussion was often, politically tinged. The reality is really that while U.S. LNG exports to Europe, would be greatly symbolic, and in fact they have been successful with exports to Spain and Portugal. In reality, they would have a somewhat difficult time competing in some parts of Europe, particularly Europe that is closer to Russia, that has access to Russian gas pipelines. But the picture shouldn't end here, because at the end of the day, when gas is becoming a global commodity, and this is what I started my discussion with, that means that the inflow of more natural gas into the market from the United States creates more liquidity and optionality overall. So that means customers in Europe, while they may still rely primarily on Russian gas, they have now more liquidity in the market to import gas from somewhere else. And we have the Lithuanian ambassador here, and Lithuania launched its LNG terminal in 2014. And while, it would be, I think, greatly symbolic if a U.S. LNG tanker one day sailed into Klaipėda, that's probably not likely. But instead, or if it does, it will, won't be the major source of Lithuania's gas. But instead, Lithuania now imports its gas from Norway using this tanker. So this is the example of the type of dynamics that play out in the end.
Right. The last question I will ask, at least for now, and then turn it to the audience. I can see from the audience that there are a lot of people here who have some interest in the so-called Southern Gas Corridor that will take gas from offshore Azerbaijan and the Caspian through Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey and on into Europe. We have a situation where I think Turkey is probably looking to this new administration for a stronger relationship with the United States. My guess is that the Azerbaijani government thinks that there may be an opportunity for a stronger relationship. Certainly the Russians think so. What does this mean? What might it mean for the Southern Corridor? Because all those three countries may, to some extent, have different interests. And how might all this play out? And again, does whatever we think about it, let's say whatever we think about now, the new administration, how much support we want to give or not for gas coming from the Caspian, what do you think the effect of all of this could be? Tim?
I'm not sure how much it matters. The projects that we've seen in the past that were heavily supported, politically supported and motivated, were the ones that had a really hard time coming to fruition. And so at the end of the day, we need gas demand to grow in Europe, and then maybe some support to help a project underway. But I think that's the key. The key issue is still that you need demand growth, and you need private parties to be interested in putting money on the table. Now, there's been some progress on a moderate version, obviously, of what is then still called the Southern Corridor. I don't know if that name's still valid, but let's say so. If that 10 BCM gets there, then and that's good news. I mean, I don't want to dismiss that, but I will observe that over the years, an incredible amount of time and political capital has been spent on those 10 BCMs, and now they're from a European, even now demand has shrunk substantially over the last couple of years. That's still not much more than a drop in a bucket when you look at European gas demand overall. So is it worth it? I'll leave that up as an open question.
Well, I think the Southern Gas Corridor, there are a lot of great expectations for the Southern Gas Corridor, and I think its political significance cannot be underestimated. This will be, if it becomes when it becomes operational, it will be the first time that Europe will get Caspian gas. Now, considering how the global energy markets, the global gas markets have changed, with, as I mentioned, European importers now having more optionality, that commercial significance of the corridor perhaps is lesser than before. But when you started off your question with Turkey, I think Turkey is really the country to watch because Turkey is both for Europe and for Russia, it's a key state in their energy visions and strategies. Europe looks to Turkey to implement the Southern Gas Corridor and help with its diversification efforts. Russia looks to Turkey to try to actually maintain its influence over Eurasian energy markets, and it tries to woo Turkey with the alternative Turk Stream pipeline project and so on. And the political card continuously upsets the waters there as Turkey-Russia relations are, experiencing ups and downs and turbulence, and as Turkey's relationship with the West and the United States is also experiencing some shifts. So I think really Turkey is the country to watch for the next U.S. administration.
Anything?
Actually, Dick, the expertise of the three of you just really outweighs mine on this issue. So I'd like to ask a question instead. Given your recent experience and years in Azerbaijan, what's your perspective on this issue?
Good question.
Okay, I'm supposed to be the moderator.
We aren't going to let you get away with that.
I guess here's where I come out on that. If I had to bet, and I think we all agree that, really at the end of the day, who knows that how these various relationships are going to play out. But if I had to bet, I would say, absent problems that the TAP pipeline is still having on landing places in Italy and that kind of thing, that the program as it presently is will take place. That there's been too much invested already, that Turkey is a major player and shareholder in both in Shah Deniz and in the TANAP pipeline, that the Turkey-Azerbaijan relationship is strong enough that I don't think Turkey would do anything that would be totally inconsistent with Azerbaijan's interests, and that Russia can live with 10 BCM going on to Europe, it being a relatively small amount. I think what to watch is the future and what kind of expansion might take place. And I think that these various relationships could have an effect on future expansion. But I would expect to see at least the present plan of 16 BCM coming from Shah Deniz, 6 to Turkey, 10 on to Europe will happen. If things really get messed up in Europe as to landing sites and that kind of thing, it wouldn't shock me if Turkey would be willing to take all of the gas. I don't think that the commercial folks involved and the companies would like to see that happen. And there are contracts, but you don't know. So I guess that's where I see it. Why don't we open it up? I saw the first hand I saw was from another former ambassador to Azerbaijan, going back some, Rich Kozlerich, who's also a professor at George Mason.
Thanks, Dick. And my question has nothing directly to do with Azerbaijan and Southern Gas Corridor. But what would be wrong with letting markets determine a lot of these issues as to whether there will be exports or not, or where those exports will go? We've gotten in a bad habit of energy diplomacy, and we start to sound sometimes a lot like Russia.
Don't forget, this is public.
I understand, but why we're at a point where infrastructure is there, the global market, as you point out in your paper, is changing. Why not let the markets make these choices now?
I think certainly the markets will be making those choices, and the markets will be the primary driver of where gas will go and how it will be traded and who will be the partners. But I think there's also, there's also an opportunity. There's also an opportunity for countries to leverage their economic power. There's an opportunity for countries to leverage their energy power. There's an opportunity for energy diplomacy. I mean, we live also not just in an economic world. We live in a political economy, you can say. So I think it's, for me, this report and some of my thoughts, they take the changing market as a starting point. And then I see, well, what more can we do with this in the interest of the United States and in the interest of America's allies?
Sudine and then Tim?
Sure. That's a fascinating question. And it points out that there is a difference, and there has been a difference of how, at least in the US, different agencies have approached it. So my old agency, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, is almost 100% market-based. And the decisions are based almost purely on markets. The Department of Energy, with their export authorizations, is not. And I think that the answer to that discrepancy, or the reason for that discrepancy, is exactly what Anya said. When we get into the international realm as opposed to the domestic realm, markets is perhaps the beginning of the story and the beginning of the trade, but there are other factors, strategic national security factors that can play out.
I think, Ambassador, you're absolutely right. And I think that to a large extent that has happened already. And I think that as a nice bonus, you have some diplomatic advantages to that. I think that's great. To what extent you can actually steer those bonuses, that's much harder to pin down, I think.
Okay. Our friend from Lithuania.
Yes, thank you. It was a very interesting panel. And yes, we would like to benefit from this U.S. diplomacy in gas market, and we have worked hard to be able to do this because we had no choice just 2 years ago. Now we have choice. And actually we have also the first contract with U.S. supplier. So it doesn't need to be, of course, American gas. It could be gas from anywhere, but we have a trader who has an obligation and price limits on which he will be delivering gas to Lithuania. But my question would be, it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on Russia and LNG market. I mean, because we hear about the ambition to develop LNG capacity in Russia. So do you see the Russia also as a strong player in the LNG market in the future?
Well, Russia has certainly been behind as a player in LNG. For previously the largest gas producer in the world and such a significant exporter, it always relied on pipelines based on the existing infrastructure. So it came very late to the LNG markets. It really has a strategy. I mean, part of Russia's national energy strategy is to gear up LNG exports. And their first focus is the Asian markets. So this is, again, another area where I see competition between American energy companies and Russian energy interests.
Tim, you want to add anything?
No, I don't.
Okay, I'm going to go to this side of the room, and then I'll sort of rotate around and hopefully get everybody. Yes, over. Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much. My name is Carlos dos Santos. I'm the ambassador of Mozambique.
Welcome.
And thank you very much. And I wanted to start by thanking the Atlantic Council for convening this panel discussion. We are a new global province of natural gas, as you know. And, excuse me, we are very much interested in, sorry, my voice. We are very much interested in these debates. And the one thing I would like to ask the panel to unpack is this concept of America first energy policy versus diplomacy and U.S. leadership. From where I stand, diplomacy means negotiation and not only my way. Is this around this concept that we are going to work? the diplomacy and U.S. leadership. We welcome U.S. leadership. I think it's good, but within the context of diplomacy, I think it's good. The other question I wanted to ask, before here I was in the UK, and shale gas is a real problem to be developed in the UK and Europe, I think. Is that a problem here, or that has been overcome? The laws of the land allow shale gas to be explored without a problem, concerns with the environment, all that. Thank you.
Well, I could give you my views on that, but let's start with a panel on the shale part,
On the shale,
or on anything else.
well, both. I mean, I wish I could unpack and the America First energy policy. For the time, it seems to imply that the administration is in favor of continuing with production and supporting LNG exports. But I think at the same time, this is some of the maybe potential contradictions we've discussed. Will that change, let's say, if prices rise, if there are considerations for American industry, if there are considerations for, domestic economic considerations. So I think that's a real question. Maybe then this kind of leadership and exports will take a back seat to, America First, and we use our own gas for domestic consumption. So I think that's the big question to watch. In terms of shale gas, yes, the American shale revolution has really been the driver of this boost in American gas production. So over the last 16 years, the United States, shale production from shale in the U.S. total natural gas production went from 1% to more than 50%. So it's really shale gas that has been the driver of this boom. In other countries and other parts of the world, it has not been so successful. In fact, no one has been able to replicate America's success story. I mean, Canada has done well. Other countries that have been successful in fracking have been Argentina and China, but nowhere near, at least until today, to the same scale as the United States.
And the reason that the United States and Canada are leaders in shale gas production has not so much to do with differences in technology from the rest of the world, but the legal system and the ownership of the resource. So in America, it's not a national resource, it's a private resource. And the shale gas deposit is owned by the owner of the land over it. So the interests are aligned. So if you're an individual and you own a piece of the land over a shale play, it is probably in your interest to have it developed, because then you reap the revenue stream, as opposed to if that revenue stream went to the government. Then you might, if you had control over access to your land to get the shale gas, you may not be interested in doing it. So it's an alignment of the legal system. And gas production in the U.S. is regulated by the states as opposed to the federal government. So, and you've seen that play out in the U.S. to an extent. For example, there are the shale play, the Marcellus, that's in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, extends into New York. And the governor of New York, in response to the wishes of New Yorkers, has banned shale development in New York. On the other hand, Pennsylvania and West Virginia have not done so, in part because of the contribution of that to their own economic development. Particularly in West Virginia, which is losing its coal production, and it can be replaced by some of its shale production, some of that revenue.
Maybe just to add a little bit, because I think Anya's right. There are opportunities in places like Argentina. There are other issues in Argentina, but certainly shale is very much of a possibility. China, look at Russia too over time, but it's not going to happen in Europe, in my view. And there are three reasons. What Sudin said is very important: the issue over mineral rights and who has the resource rights. Second, huge environmental opposition, including, I would add, Russian-fueled opposition in Eastern Europe. I think they are very much behind the environmental protests in places like Romania and Bulgaria. And just a different geology that hasn't worked out as well. So I would not expect much from Europe, but maybe from some of these other places. Let's go to the middle area. We have a hand right here.
Hello, Domagoj Vidakovic, Croatian and US. So, question on LNG. I'm glad Lithuania is much faster done LNG terminal than in Croatia. What is your view of Croatian LNG as we speak right now in America First energy policy? I know Ambassador Hochstein was there. We didn't see anybody from this administration, so what's your view on that?
You know, again, building for countries in Southern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe that previously were essentially captive markets for Gazprom, that could only import, or the majority of their gas from Russia, building LNG terminals gives them optionality, gives them flexibility. It allows them to better negotiate even their gas contracts with Gazprom, which was evident in the case of Lithuania. So, and also, as I discussed, the global gas markets have changed. So in these markets, it's a great option to have an LNG import terminal. Now, where that gas will come from, whether it will come from the United States, as we discussed, I don't think it matters so much. With this greater liquidity, there will be more options for other countries, from maybe Norway, maybe from North Africa, and so on, for LNG. My quick, I don't know.
Anybody
Tim
else?
wants
Well,
to-
I think that's right. I mean, there is an opportunity to do so. I think one of the challenges is that the Croatian market's small, its demand is small, and so you depend on cooperation with neighboring countries and make sure that you can ship that gas to those countries too. And I think that's where some of the challenges, the key challenges, have been. Those need to be resolved in Croatia and in Budapest and other neighboring countries, and it's not up to investors, or that's what governments need to sort out.
Mm-hmm. And there's just a brief, and because we discussed a lot about markets versus politics, but in cases like this, and the case of Lithuania, political commitment also makes a difference. And certainly you have to have the investors, you have to have the commercial interests, but when the market is small like this, the case of Croatia, the case of Lithuania, that political determination and that political interest to carry it through also matters.
Yeah. I might just add briefly, maybe other than you, have you been there at the site?
Yes.
Yeah, so I may be the only other person in the room who actually has been at the site of the terminal. And this was some 7 years ago, and my guess is that it looks exactly the same today as it did.
We went from land-based terminal, now we're talking about floaters.
Right,
We are progressing.
But, the problem then, and I think still a problem, is getting a consortium of companies together who are willing to take the market risk to do it. I would just add briefly, though, we at the Atlantic Council presented a paper on a north-south corridor going from basically from the Baltics, Poland and Lithuania, to Croatia, and building connections there. Whether or not that can help push the development of that terminal, we'll see. And there are also potentially new sources of gas. Whether even the Eastern Mediterranean could play a role ultimately someday with respect to a terminal there. It's something that my friend Gianni in the front row from Eni might be interested in. Or not. But in any event, so we'll see what happens. But it's been as you said, a slow process. Okay, let me go to this side, and I'm going to keep going back and forth. We still have 25 minutes. It's good. There are brief questions, brief answers. Let's go ahead. Doug.
Doug Hengel, German Marshall Fund. I wanted to come back to the...
We're ending, sorry. Okay, go ahead, Doug.
I wanted to come back to the issue of markets and economics. So notwithstanding the little jump in prices in January, because there seemed to be a shortage of gas on the market, it appears we're headed into an oversupply situation on LNG, at least for the next few years and maybe beyond that. So is there, will U.S. LNG be competitive against Australia and Qatar and others? How can we make ourselves more competitive? As part of the America First, how can we make sure our gas is the one that's exported and can compete well against all the others out there?
Well, I'll get help from my panelists, but my first take is, we've had these conditions of, oversupply or tremendous supply already, and despite the market, maybe let's say skepticism, we saw, let's say when we started in 2014, this was market exuberance. We thought we'll be sending, U.S. LNG instantly everywhere, and then we had this market pessimism. But at the end of the day, 2016 showed that even in low price conditions, and even with considerable liquidity or oversupply or glut, however you want to call it, in the market, American LNG was still successful, and as I mentioned, the list went across the world. Also, LNG investments tend to be, these are long-term investments, and contracts are signed for the long term. So these price fluctuations have an impact on the immediate, in the, the spot market and short-term trades, but in the longer-term contracts and considerations, they tend to be tempered and balanced. But
I'm not really sure how much. I think you're right, Doug, that we're entering a phase of a lot of oversupply, and I'm not really sure we've seen that much of it. I think a good indicator would be if lots of cargoes flow to continental Europe and are taken in there, and we've seen some. I mean, UK has a price floor, so obviously there it makes more sense, and you have fuel switching, and so we've seen an uptick there. But we've seen a lot, I think, seasonal demand-driven supplies going first Latin America, then Asia with the cold winter. Okay, all of that makes sense. And now more projects are coming to market. Mind you that in the majority of the U.S. projects is not yet operational. Even of the first project, most of the trains are not operational. So it's all in a pretty early stage. A number of Australian projects coming to market in coming years. So I think we're entering that phase. And a big question then is, how does demand respond, right? And I guess everyone is wondering, does that incentivize incremental demand? And I think that's obviously the hope of the market players. And to what extent it happens, we'll have to wait and see. Will the major consuming countries in Asia take in additional volumes? Are they ready to do that? And what about all the small-scale importers that we've seen emerge over the last couple of years? Egypt and Jordan, Lithuania, Colombia, Kuwait. There's a whole host of countries. If you put them all together, the aggregate demand is pretty substantial. But I think the question that we have to grapple with is, okay, fine. If you add all that up, what does that then mean, and how much time does it then take to consume those additional volumes that are coming to market? And whether that's going to be 3 years, it's going to be 8 years, is really hard to pin down on.
I would put two caveats on what's been said. One is, yes, I think there have been more exports than have been expected. But there are two questions I would have, and I don't know the answers to them. But one question is, I think some companies might want to be exporting, even at a loss, if it is a loss, I don't know, just to show that it can be done. But the second part of it is, and I was in business for many years, and we'd find times when we would sell products at a loss because it still covered overhead, and we were better off selling it than not. And that might be I don't know whether that's the case now. I just don't know with some companies. It could be, because there's been a lot of overhead invested. You can't do that forever, but in the short to midterm you can. Short term certainly. So I don't know whether that's a factor or not. Okay, a question from the middle. Okay, I'll tell you what we're going to do. Because is that a hard stop at 10:15? No? Bina's the boss over there. She's the one. Okay, well, we'll go a few minutes over, and if people have to leave, they can leave. Let's take two questions at a time. Your question, and then, Bob, your question.
Right, thanks. Rex Wempen, Northern Resource. I have a two-part question on the theme of state intervention. First, for Sudine. What do you think is the fulcrum security, i.e. the critical point for expediting approvals now, and how would your firm and others like it attack this question, if you care to comment on legal strategy publicly? And second, continuing on this theme of state intervention, outside the spot market, isn't it rather a fantasy to say that there's a global energy market, given the mercantilist positions of large countries in Southern and Eastern Asia? And if so, what can or should the U.S. be doing to create a more globalized market? Thank you.
Bob?
Thank you. Bob Eichort for the Atlantic Council. Tim, you mentioned Mexico. And obviously that's of great interest right now in terms of the Trump administration and what our policies will be with regards to Mexico. And I think it's important from our standpoint, from the standpoint of market, regulatory approvals, as well as the overall policy relationships and trade relationships with Mexico. So I was interested in your comments on that aspect. We've seen enormous growth in the gas demand, and many pipelines currently and future planned, in large part spurred by the plans for major investment in factories, including automobile factories and others in Mexico. Some of those have been held up, Ms. Kelly, by regulatory concerns, environmental concerns. But certainly it came up in Perry's nomination hearing, and he was very positive about the potential of that relationship in the future. So as Piñetas maybe coming to Washington, it's going to be very interesting to see how this plays into the broader discussion. So I'd be interested in your comment, Jan.
Okay.
Fascinating. I love your question because it focuses on what's the solution to the problem. And the way that I think about it is that the issuance of these authorizations involves three different pieces of law: a statute, a regulation, and a policy. And it's hard to change the statute. I would expect, though, that this Congress, with the Republican majority in both houses and with a Secretary of Energy and a president pro-LNG export, that we may see changes to the statute. It'll just take a while. The regulations, it's a little easier to change. It's much easier to change a regulation than a statute, but it still involves a process. Probably takes at a minimum 9 months. But policy can be changed on a dime. So that's where I would focus for my clients, because there are policies both at FERC and at DOE that could be changed the moment there is a new head of the agency. At FERC, the change in policy would involve putting more resources into that area. FERC divides its resources up among electricity, gas, and oil. And historically, at least most recent history, the resources have been in electricity because electric markets have gobbled them up. And I think it's time to move resources into gas. And it could be done relatively easily. And more focus could be put on FERC's relationship with the cooperating agencies to have shorter timelines and demand more quicker response. And in an administration with where all the goals seem to be aligned around this, I think you could achieve that if you were determined to do that. And at DOE, it's frankly a policy as to what it means to be in the public interest. And it can be changed on a case-by-case basis. So approaching the Secretary of Energy and having a discussion about what exactly the policy is, what you want it to be, and why it should change, I think would likely bear fruit.
And the second, the Mexico?
Yeah, I'd be. Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think it's a major concern for the Mexicans. Obviously, my neighbor, office neighbor at Columbia, Adrian Lajus, used to be the CEO of Pemex, and he does a lot of work on this, obviously, and is deeply concerned about the developments that we see unfold now. The Mexican economy obviously is organized in a way that's pegged to NAFTA, to increase trade, as you described as well, with Mexico. I think by the end of the decade, there'll be 15 entry points for natural gas flowing into Mexico. I think imports have tripled over the last 5 years or so. So demand is rising rapidly. It's mostly for electricity generation, some industrial activity, of course, as well. And the country has very limited options, right? It has 3 regasification terminals, but they're increasingly outcompeted by cheap Texas gas. So you have some options. You have no storage capacity in the country. So you're on the one hand, you had assumed, as Mexican government, you had assumed that you would have favorable trade relations with the U.S. And all of a sudden, you have to at least ask questions about this, right? And I think that, I mean, I think as you alluded to, and I think that's absolutely right. On the one hand, there seems to be a lot of support within this government for energy trade, and that would include then obviously exports to Mexico. The energy secretary was closely involved in all of this and would obviously support this. But yeah, at the same time, you have a president who says, I want to renegotiate NAFTA. And I want to build a wall, and so this environment clouds that what seems like from a business point of view a very logical cooperation that's been very fruitful for both the United States and for Mexico. So it clouds these efforts, and what that means going forward is hard. But it already costs Mexico, right? We've seen Adrian mentioned to me the other day. We've seen foreign direct investment in Mexico slow down because of the uncertainty and political risk, and it's expected that will continue. Every time the president tweets about the wall, about Mexico, the value of the peso drops. And so this actually already hurts Mexico. The country is heading into elections next year, and one of the candidates is suggesting that the reforms that the Mexican authorities have been working on, David Goldman here did a lot of work on that too, next to Adrian. One of the candidates suggested maybe we should slow that down. Should we really do that? This is obviously ammunition for that discussion. Should we go down that road in which we cooperate with the United States, whereas we don't really know what the long-term objectives of this country are? So I think major uncertainty and worries at least on the Mexican side.
And the drama is going to continue over the next week, given the Mexican president's response to the wall and whether he still comes to Washington.
Of course,
and all
of course.
That. Okay, how many people still have questions? 2, I see 2. Okay, let's take, 3. I'm going to take the 3 questions all at once, and then we're going to close it down. 2 over here. Sorry, Lee, I saw you last. Okay.
Good morning. My name is Vagar Gurbanov. I am from Embassy of Azerbaijan. Thank you very much for this timely discussion, and thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for your comments on Southern Gas Corridor. Very much appreciate, and thank you very much for your efforts to bring this. When you were working in Baku, obviously this can be a 10 BCM project, but availability of infrastructure in place and capacity, which is much more beyond than 10 BCM, is an asset for the region. My question is on other aspect. Taking into account 2 things: availability of vast gas reserves in the world and in the Middle East, and as Dr. Ragnar mentioned, gas becoming a kind of global commodity with LNG and with other opportunities. Do you think in the coming 5 years, new global players in the gas market, and especially in the European market? And what do you think, how would be new administration reaction of coming new competitors or new gas players to the market? Thank you.
Good. Okay. Second question back there.
Did I get it? Sorry. I'm Rachel with S&P Global News. I was wondering, a follow-up to Sudin, when you mentioned that the current DOE export authorizations have a clause that say the case can be reopened. I'm wondering if gas prices rise, if there's a risk at all that authorizations that have already been given out could potentially be rolled back.
Okay. And then Michael Ratner, third question.
Sure. Michael Ratner with Congressional Research Service.
Mine are a couple of comments. One is that DOE has approved about 15 BCF per day of LNG exports to non-free trade countries, which is about 20% of our gas production currently. Even if DOE granted, as you said, they can define the public interest any way they want, and Secretary Perry could approve every project on day one, but that's not going to change the FERC process. And there has not been as much consternation with the FERC process because people know it, and it takes time, and people go through it. And so, again, I think the market will bear out how much LNG exports actually get built, how many terminals get built. I'd also like to point out that it's not necessarily the terminal owner who's on the hook. It's the people who sign the offtake contract. So BG Group is doing, which is now Shell, is doing their best to move that gas around the market, and they're doing a good job with it. But they're also, they would prefer to be just sending the gas for 20 years to one terminal. And that said, the last comment I have has to do with a saying in this town of where you stand depends upon where you sit. And now Mr. Tillerson is sitting, or will be sitting, at the State Department and not at Exxon. And I think that potentially will change his perspective, but historically Exxon and many companies don't want the U.S. government in their business. And that particularly when it comes to shale development, it's been the small players, not the big players, that have been pushing the innovation, and that's kind of the last component of what kind of spurred our development. So I'll stop there in the absence of time.
So,
okay, let me do this. The three of you, you've heard the three questions. Why don't each of you make your closing comments and respond to which of the questions you want to respond to? So maybe starting Tim at
Yeah, that's fine. I'll be very brief, and I'll leave it to two ladies. New players on the demand side, for sure, right? So we're seeing that already. Smaller, and that's good news, by the way. More countries that use new technology to import LNG, even on smaller scale. I think that's all good news. More liquidity, more trade, all that's good news, and I think we'll see that happen. On the production side, I'm not so sure. Because you asked for global players. I think you may refer to, for instance, Iran, but it seems to me that even though the reserves obviously are enormous, the vast majority of those may well be gobbled up domestically, and so I don't know to what extent it will actually be an international player in the short and medium term.
The market and the development of infrastructure. It is traditional in the United States with the development of particularly gas infrastructure where all of the authority is in the federal government as opposed to, say, electricity infrastructure where it's shared with the states, that since 1992, the emphasis has been on markets and letting the markets work. And that's been FERC's philosophy. FERC will certificate as many applications for infrastructure development as come to it, because FERC knows that that infrastructure will not be built unless there's demand for it. To me, that makes a lot of sense. And over the last 25 years, that policy has worked well. We don't have overbuild in the U.S. We've kept up with demand, with infrastructure. So I think you're right on, and I think that will continue. It was interesting to be at FERC and watch DOE not take a market approach to export licenses. A lot of discussion in the halls. Why would they do that? They do that because they have a different mission. FERC's mission is build the infrastructure that we need. DOE's mission is more diverse. But it's a matter of policy, so it can be interpreted differently by this administration. I think it will. I think it'll be more market-oriented, particularly Secretary Perry and his experience in Texas.
Tying a little bit the two questions together, there are indeed vast reserves in the world, but we've discussed already some of the conditions that made the U.S. unique and created the shale boom here. I mean, other factors are also American entrepreneurship, financing availabilities, and the fact that there were many small competitive companies in the market. And that is not the case generally across the world. And therefore, in the rather short time horizon you gave of about 5 years, you know, most people don't expect tremendous success stories to happen elsewhere. But of course, we were always surprised by technology and other factors that can arise. Now, in terms of the U.S. response, I think we have to remember that for some countries that are traditionally energy producers, this is their main lifeline. This is their main source of revenues. We're considering Russia, countries in the Middle East. The United States is not in a similar position. So therefore, even if more competition and more producers emerge on the international market, this is not going to serve a blow to the American economy.
Okay, I think this is about it. First of all, let me thank just this wonderful audience. Big audience, great questions. Thank you for your participation. Thank you, Anya, for doing the report. And it certainly generated a tremendous amount of excellent discussion. Great job. And also our panelists, other panelists, Tim and Sudin, thank you. And for your participation. And so I hope we'll see you again soon at another event. Thank you very much.